Thank you, Carolyn, for a nice introduction, and thank everybody for having me. It's really fun to be here. I've never been to Merced, and everybody's been wonderful so far. It's a beautiful campus. Delighted to be here. And coming here is helping me toward my life goal of going to give a talk at every UC. I'm almost there. But for a philosopher, it's hard to do it at San Francisco, which is medical. I will find a way. So I couldn't be more excited to talk about this work, this joint work with Andy Keller. Andy is an actual linguist, and he actually knows stuff. And so all the stuff that is in the talk that is correct and well thought out, that's from him, and all the rest is from me. We've been talking about this material now for a long time and hope one day to get a paper out. The way I want to do this, I decided to put together a handout rather than a PowerPoint. That's traditional in linguistics, it turns out, because when you give people examples, it's nice to have the examples in your hand and they don't go away off the slide when you look at them. So I think that's a useful tradition, so that's what I'm going to do for this. So I guess the best way to start is just to throw out the phenomenon that we're interested in. We think this is a kind of extra semantic expansion that hasn't really been studied. I almost want to say it hasn't been noticed by others. It has in places, but I think focus has not been on this in the rest of the literature, and this kind of expansion doesn't fit well under the other types of extra semantic expansion that have been studied much more extensively. So the phenomenon can be seen in an example like 1A. A jogger was hit by a car in Palo Alto last night, which is an old example of Jerry Hobbs. So when you see that example, you're probably getting that the jogger was jogging at the time of the accident, at the time of being hit by a car. Actually, it's also in the literature that it was an accident. I didn't say that either. And just to see the contrast, it can be useful to just replace the indefinite head noun a jogger in 1A with a farmer in 1B, and there's just nothing, there's nothing corresponding to that. It's a much weaker invitation to infer that the farmer was farming at the time that the car hit him or her in 1B. One thing to note immediately is that the inference here is defeasible, right? So you can, for example, cancel the inference by saying a jogger was hit by a car in Palo Alto last night. Of course, she wasn't jogging at the time, right? And that's perfectly felicitous. Indeed, not only can it be canceled, it can also be reinforced. So you can say, as in 1C, this is, I guess, the second half of that, a jogger was hit by a car in Palo Alto last night, and in fact, she was jogging at the time of the accident. That's felicitous also, I take it. So those two criteria are interesting, the reinforceability and cancelability, because those are traditional earmarks of extra semantic status. I mean, this is all controversial, needless to say, but those have often been taken by theorists as reasons to think that the content in question that can be canceled or reinforced is not part of the literal content semantically expressed by the string. And so you can see canonical examples of that test going on in 2A and 2B. So these are Grice's examples. Grice was actually trying to convince us that the extra content that you get out of a string like John is meeting a woman this evening really should be given extra semantic status. So he argues for that by pointing out that you can reinforce and cancel the content that the person is not John's wife. So that's the force of 2A. But notice that, just to get the contrast, in 2B, if you try to cancel or reinforce the impression that the woman is female, it's bad. So the thought there is that the badness of the cancellation and reinforcement really suggests that the information that the person was a female is semantically encoded in the literal content of John is meeting a woman this evening. Right? So if that's the criterion and you've got 2A with extra semantic status sitting on one side and 2B with semantic status sitting on the other side, well then we claim that the ligature that you get in 1A patterns with the extra semantic example 2a. Okay. So that's nice. We have one example so far of our kind of inference. You might think, well, how widely do you get this kind of occurrence? Well, we think it actually shows up in lots of different configurations. So one place where it shows up is in definite descriptions. So I've already given you the indefinite, but here's the case with the definite. So this is an example that Kronfeld gave in 1990. He asks you to suppose that the city Washington, D.C. turns out to be both the city with the greatest diversity of languages spoken and also the murder capital of the world. Just grant those suppositions. Then he says, well, look, 3A, 3B, and 3C should express semantically the same thing, right? Because the head noun phrase in each of those examples refers to the very same city, right? But I don't know, 3A is unexceptional, 3B kind of interesting. There's some kind of extra semantic something going on there, although we have to figure out what it is. And 3C is just weird. It's hard to figure out what is going on in 3C. Like, why would the mayor ever introduce why would the mayor ever stand up and say, I welcome the LSA by expressing 3C? That's just weird. Okay. But so that's one case of it. Somebody's calling with an objection about that. It's a good example, I think. Okay. Another place you can see it is, this isn't going to be on the head noun itself. This is going to be on modifiers of the head noun. So in 4A, the drug-addled undergraduate fell off the Torrey Pines cliffs. I hope you're getting the inference that being drug-addled had some causal relationship to falling off the Torrey Pines cliffs. That's probably partially causally responsible for the falling, something like that. In 4B, you don't get any such inference. We suggest being well-liked just doesn't seem to have anything to do with falling off the Torrey Pines cliffs, where with 4C you get a counter to expectation inference. So being normally risk-averse is actually quite relevant to falling, but in fact it looks like it's not that being normally risk-averse causes the falling. In fact, it's counter to the expectations that you associate with being normally risk-averse. So that's another place where it shows up in these modifiers of head nouns. You also get the occurrence to happen in relative clause modifiers in object noun phrases. So these are the examples in 5A, B, and C. So here I've switched to the object NP as opposed to the subject NP. And again, these are occurring inside relative clauses. 5A, the company fired the manager who was embezzling money. Again, so A, B, and C in 5 are supposed to be just like A, B, and C in 4. You start out with a good eliciture. It looks like there's an inference to the embezzlement being partially causally responsible for the firing. In 5B, it's neutral, so there doesn't seem to be any reason to think that the hiring in 2002 has anything to do with the firing. And in 5C, there's a counter to expectations inference. It's just weird that having a long history of corporate rewards would be partially causally responsible for the firing. Okay. And not only do you get it in all these syntactic configurations, but we even think you can have non-lexical cases where there's just no particular lexical item that is the locus you want to associate with the eliciture. So in 6A, if I say, my new alarm clock is annoying, I invite the inference that the alarm clock is annoying because it's loud. Whereas if I say, my new alarm clock is annoying, I invite you to infer that there's something about the timbre of the delivery, the manner of articulation or something, that's responsible for the annoyingness of the alarm clock. So we want to say, and this is just an initial gloss that of course deserves further elaboration, we want to say about these examples that the speaker is deciding to use some way of expressing her content. In most of these cases, that's picking out an entity. over available alternatives. I want to include manner of articulation as being one dimension of particular way. Okay? Because otherwise I wouldn't be able to capture 6A and 6B. But I want to say the choice to use that particular way as opposed to some other available ways, that invites the speaker, that invites the hearer to draw inferences which are not triggered by any specific syntactic relationship or other kind of requirement imposed by the linguistic material. Okay? So we need a label for this phenomenon. And so the label that we came up with is eliciture. So of course we're trying to ride on the coattails of Grice's word implicature. But we're not the first people to do that. So there's also Bach's notion, which we're going to talk about soon, impliciture. And relevance theorists talk about explicature. And so we thought, oh, those are such cool labels. Bach was so lucky that all the other ones existed, and there was exactly one more thing to do, impliciture, perfect. What can we come up with? So finally we landed on eliciture. So we're trying to ride on those coattails, but we're also trying to suggest with the label that there's some kind of elicitation of further inferences that wouldn't otherwise be drawn without that particular way of expressing the content. Okay, so that's just a presentation of what the phenomenon is, just through some examples, and an initial gloss. That's all I've done so far. The next thing is, this is supposed to be a talk series on experimental philosophy. And so I thought I'd just tell you about a quick little experiment that we ran to try to confirm the existence of these inferences. We used a McTurk passage completion experiment. And I need to tell you about a little bit of background about how we did this. We just focused our attention on the relative clause examples, like 5A through C. And so the background is this. There's this class of verbs that gets called implicit causality verbs. And so as you might expect, implicit causality verbs, the thought is that they have something to do with causation. Right? Causation is somehow expressed in them. And typically, what does the causing is one of the arguments of the verb, typically one of the animate arguments of the verb, right? So I don't want to rest a lot on that analysis. That wasn't very good as an analysis. I'm not going to rest a lot on that definition of implicit causality verbs. I'm just giving you what the common gloss is. We just kind of like reached into a list, you know, of what are supposed to be canonical implicit causality verbs. But why do we do that? Well, here's a kind of interesting fact about implicit causality verbs. When you stick implicit causality verbs into a causal clause with an ambiguous pronoun that looks like this form that I have on the sheet, noun phrase, verb, noun phrase because pronoun, where the pronoun's ambiguous, that shows up a kind of bias that goes with the particular verb for the attribution of the causal agency. So some verbs, we tend to be biased in favor of attributing the causal agency to the subject NP. And other verbs, looks like we attribute causal agency to the object NP. So you can see this showing up in the difference between 7A and 7B. And all I've done, the difference between 7A and 7B, is just switching out the verbs. And I've given two examples of each sort, object biased and subject biased. So in 7A, if I say, Sally frightens Mary because she is beautiful, who's she? What's she co-referential with? Is it Sally or is it Mary? Answer, Sally. And that looks like it's a property of that verb, frightens. Okay. Again, you could have lots of interesting questions about how robust a category this is, what's the status of the biasing relations, all kinds of good questions here. We don't really have a lot to say about that. Again, we just reached into the list. These are the object biased ones we want. Okay. So I gave you the frightens one, that's subject biased. Loves looks like it's object biased. So the same string, just swapping out the verb, Sally loves Mary because she is beautiful. Who's beautiful? Mary, not Sally. So that's one piece of background. And then the other piece of background you need to know is that when you do a passage completion experiment on those kinds of verbs, that is, you generate a sentence with that kind of verb, and then you just tell the subject, you give me the next sentence, subjects will typically give you an explanation. That's what they'll put in for the blank. Now, in cases where the verbs are object biasing, we thought, that means the agency is being attributed to the object, right? And so what counts as being the explainer of the causal event that's just been described will focus on properties of that object NP, who is, after all, the cause. Okay. Hence, what we could do is we could manipulate the relative clause modifiers on the object NP. And that would have the effect of twiddling whether a completion was provided, whether the completion that was provided provided an explanation or not. So to see examples of that, look at our first example. The professor awarded the student who received a perfect score on the final, who stopped by during office hours yesterday, who failed to hand in any one of the homeworks. Okay, these are, in order, supposed to be cases where the first relative clause is an explanation, or generates an explanation by itself of the causal event described in the professor awarded the student. The middle line, who stopped by during office hours yesterday, that's just neutral, okay, about the event. And the third relative clause, who failed to hand in any of the homeworks, that's actually counter to expectation. Right? So this is just mirroring the pattern we saw earlier in 5ABC. Explanation, no explanation, violated expectation. Okay? And so what we were thinking is, we'll do a three-way context manipulation on those kinds of relative clauses. In cases where an explanation was already provided by the material somehow or other, I haven't told you how yet, the passage completion that the subject gives us is not going to supply an explanation. Why not? Because we just already had an explanation. It was already provided by the linguistic material, right? Well, where could it have come from? Well, certainly not from the explicit material. The explicit material doesn't say anything, calls anything explanatory. But our thought was relative clauses of the right type can actually generate an eliciture of an explanation. So what we expected was when we have a relative clause on the object noun phrase in one of these contexts that encodes an explanation, we expect that the passage completion is not going to be an explanation. Why? Because you don't need one. You already have one. But in the other two cases, where an explanation is not generated by an eliciture from the linguistic material, we expected you were going to see far more explanations provided in the passage completion. And that's exactly what we found. So we provide some statistics on the top of page 3. There's fewer explanations in the expel condition compared to both of the other types. Okay. So that's just a simple, quick McTurk experiment, and we take it just to confirm that this isn't all in our heads, that these pragmatic effects, or I should say extra-semantic effects, really are going on. Okay, so where are we in the sort of big picture of the talk? I've told you what the phenomenon is in broad terms. I've provided some examples of it in different kinds of configurations, and I've given you some quick and dirty empirical reasons to think that the phenomenon really does happen. So you are probably thinking, well, one thing you might be thinking is, oh, I don't believe in this phenomenon, it's all bogus. But if you have been gotten over that obstacle and you think, yeah, it's a real phenomenon, you might be thinking, well, I'm going to try to understand the phenomenon in terms of other well-studied extra-semantic enhancement effects that are already in the literature. So the first thing everybody always thinks about is Grice, which is why I sent that paper on ahead in case people want to look at that again and remember what Grice said. So Grice talks about, so what I'm about to do is product differentiation. I'm about to suggest that the impression that you could try to handle our cases with existing categories is a false impression. Okay. So let's start with Grice. So Grice talks about implicature, and he says, yeah, out of a case like 8, you get this content that the person was someone other than X's wife, mother, sister, or close platonic friend. And then he tells this story about norm violation, rational cooperation and stuff, that's supposed to explain how you generate from a string like 8 the implicature that he thinks is there. Well, sort of long story short, you guys read the material, and so you know what Grice has to say about this. One thing to notice about the story is that there's an interpretive failure that happens. So Gricean implicature arises as a rescue maneuver when something crashes and burns. What crashes and burns for Grice? Well, there's a norm violation of some type or other. And so he has a particular kind of bill of goods to sell you about what rescue maneuver to haul out when there's the crash and burn. But the key point is that it is a rescue maneuver that you do haul out when there's a failure that's happened. Okay. So I already mentioned Erik Kronfeld. He's one of the only people that we know about that's actually talked about our kinds of cases. And he is kind of an interesting figure. I think he committed suicide, actually. So he's in 1990, he wrote this book, and he talks about these eliciture effects. He doesn't call them elicitures. He just thinks about them in Gricean terms. Now, for reasons that we don't completely understand, he restricts his attention to cases that have a particular syntactic configuration. And it's even weirder than it seems, because actually the examples he gives don't have the form that he says he's going to provide an analysis of, but it's close. So we'll sort of just cut him some slack on that. So he says he's going to be looking at cases of the form, D is F, where D is a schematic letter that stands for a definite description, and F is some predicative material. And so that's supposed to be examples like, the Washington, D.C. examples that I gave you. Again, they don't quite exactly have that form if you look back at them, but close enough for jazz. Okay, so he wants to handle them in Gricean terms, though. So he's a nice example of a representative Gricean who tries to handle our kinds of cases with tools that are already in the literature. So his story is that, what's wrong with 3B? Why does 3B generate the eliciture that it generates, whatever that is? Well, it's because the availability of 3A actually makes 3B needlessly prolix. And so you're sitting there and you hear 3B and you think, well, I knew that 3A was available. So there must be some reason that the speaker chose the needlessly prolix 3B. In other words, there's a violation of the quantity maxim, right? And so you interpret 3B actually as expressing something like 9A. This is the gloss that Kronfeld gives to 3B. And he's actually putting it in, I think I'll just ignore the details of why he runs this particular story. There's a footnote about it, but he puts it in very Kreitzerian terms. Just don't worry about it. The main thing I already have said is the main thing I need, namely that there's a violation of the quantity norm, and that's why you end up with more content. Okay? The same story actually is supposed to explain why 9C, the one about the murder capital, is a bad example. Why is that weird? Well, it's just very difficult to assign any content to this needed parameter f, which is supposed to be the Criterion modal base. So you can't really figure out what is it in virtue of which any murder capital of the world would be relevant to welcoming the LSA. So you just give up, and that's why that's bad. Okay, so is that a good enough story to handle our cases? We're worried that it's not. So the first problem about it is that it's oddly limited to this one kind of syntactic configuration. But as we've already seen, the phenomenon is much wider than that one type of syntactic configuration. He's talking about definites, but the phenomenon happens with indefinites. It happens with relative clauses. It also happens in cases, like if you look at 10, where the eliciture actually doesn't come out of the predicative material at all. So there is an eliciture in 10 to the effect that being drunk was causally responsible for the car accident. But that all happens within D. So that's all part of the definite description. It has nothing to do with the interaction between D and F. So it's really unobvious how to extend the Kronfeldian story to that kind of an example. In fact, there's also examples like 11 where there are these multiple inferences where you think, okay, in 11, there's an eliciture to the effect that the drunkenness was causally responsible for the car accident, and there's another inference that that was causally responsible for eventually coming home, right? Or maybe that's not a causal inference. Maybe that's just a kind of elaboration of the sequence of events. But in any case, that's an eliciture, right? So that is an interaction. The first interaction was inside D, and the second one was between part of what was inside D and then what's in F. Again, the Kronfeldian story doesn't extend smoothly to that case. So that's one problem. It just looks like his theory is oddly limited, doesn't extend to the full range of cases. Second problem, we think the list of triggers that Kronfeld has is suspect. So first of all, he talks about prolixity triggering these inferences, but it's trivial to see that that's not good enough. Because if you compare 12a to 12b, 12b is more prolix than 12a. 12a says John fired the employee who was always late. You do get the eliciture, right? 12b, John fired the employee who had brown hair, a beard, and glasses. No eliciture. Okay, good. But that's more prolix. So that just seems to show that prolixity by itself isn't necessary to get the effect going. Now we can immediately hear the Gricean answering, well, look, that just shows you that there can be content generated not merely by violations of the quantity norm. There can also be problems with the relation norm, because there's a kind of irrelevance of the material brown hair, beard, glasses to fire. But we think that's kind of problematic by itself for a few reasons. First of all, as many people have pointed out, it's just completely unclear in Grice's theory what relevance is and how far hearers will go to accommodate relevance. Here's the sum total of what Grice tells you about relevance. Be relevant. That's it. So obviously there's a problem trying to implement that into a theory that actually makes predictions about cases. But that's everybody's problem, so you might not be too worried about that. You might say it's no fair saddling the Gricean with particular responsibility for coming up with a general theory of relevance. Okay, fine, but still there are other problems. The relevance-based explanation that we were just considering, it looks like it doesn't explain how you get extra semantic content conveyed in cases where there are violated expectations, such as 5C, right? Because there, with 5C, what's that example again? Oh yeah, the company fired the manager who has a long history of corporate rewards. And we saw in our McTurk experiments lots more examples like that. There is a crucial background generalization to give that makes the predicative material relevant to the, it makes the relative clause material relevant to the event of firing. But it's actually the opposite of what you would expect. So saying there's a relevance relation just doesn't seem to make the right predictions about those cases. Nor does relevance seem like it explains why you get the relevant kind of inferences, as it were, arising from the alarm clock cases. Remember when I was shouting and whining and stuff. Why is that? Well, because whatever relevance is, presumably it's a relation between contents, semantic contents, right? And so the thing that gave rise to the eliciture in those cases just wasn't even lexically expressed in any particular locus, so it didn't even have a content. So it's hard to see how you could get a relevance relation going. I mean, well, maybe you can, but you need to tell me your theory of relevance that would explain why and how you get a relevance relation going between those features of the articulation, let's call them, and the eliciture that arises. Further, we say, look, this story kind of has it backwards about relevance, because what it suggests is that you read an example where there's a definite description and then a predicate, and you see that they're supposed to be relevant to each other, and then you commence your search for what could that relation be, such that you'd satisfy the relevance norm. But that's really the wrong way to think about what's going on here. It's not like you first encounter a relevance, a relevance gap and then go off searching. No, you wouldn't even be looking, had you not recognized that there's some kind of relation of relevance between these guys in the first place. So that seems like it's a misdescription of the processing. But we want to say, okay, actually there's a bigger problem, and this is a bigger problem because it's going to spread to other theories. It's just wrong to think that the inferences we're interested in have to be triggered by a crash and burn. So if you look at 1A again, 1A was, a jogger was hit by a car in Palo Alto last night. I claim there's nothing wrong with that. It's not infelicitous in any way. It's not semantically bad, it's not syntactically bad, there's no norm violation, there's no unfilled parameter that needs saturation. There's nothing wrong with it. It's like perfectly fine by itself. So you don't need to solve a problem. In fact, if you don't generate the eliciture, it's cool. Like 1A just works fine by itself. Right? And if you do generate the eliciture, notice that it's not the case that the eliciture comes along and knocks out the old literal content and replaces it. No, they sit alongside one another. Right? The literal content remains in situ and is supplemented, not replaced, which is exactly not what we're used to seeing in the Grice kind of examples. That's an important insight to keep in mind as we go through other views. Okay, so much for Gricean attempts to try to account for our phenomenon. After Grice, there have been many attempts to try to explain other kinds of extrasemantic expansion. Some of them really arguing that Grice's equipment is too restrictive. So I just want to look at a couple more theories of that type and say that even when we look at those new tools, those post-Gricean tools, they don't really get us closer to handling our phenomena. If you look at 13A through D, these are cases that people like Bach and Sperber and Wilson have really urged on Grice. I haven't had breakfast. The thought is, that's today. Today you haven't had breakfast. Whereas with I haven't had sex, that doesn't just mean today, that means ever. Notice that's really contingent on the practices of your society. I mean, you can imagine a society where people have breakfast much more rarely and have sex much more often, and then the inferences would be quite different. But why do more examples. John and Mary are married, you get to each other. The student ran up to the edge of the cliff and jumped, not just up and down, right, off the cliff. So why do people like Bach and Sperber and Wilson think that that's damaging to Grice? Well, what they claim is you need the bracketed material to be in there in order to even have the right truth conditions. So Grice was saying, no, you go fix your literal content first. That's the first thing you do. You do your literal content without any extra semantic expansion. And then, like, there's some problem that happens, like some norm violation, and then you go get more content. Okay? But what these examples are alleged to tell us is, no, that can't always be true. Rather, you don't even get literal, if you don't do extra semantic expansion early on, you don't even have truth conditional content in the first place. Or if you do have it, you have the wrong truth conditional content in the first place, right? So if you don't know that today is part of 13a, you don't have the right literal understanding of what 13a is trying to tell you in the first place to even count whether you have a norm violated or not. Right? So what these theorists have urged is you need to allow extra semantic expansion to happen kind of earlier on. There's differences between Bach's way of thinking about this, Sperber and Wilson's way of thinking about it. Let's just elide that unless people want to talk about it. So here's a kind of neat feature of those cases. The extra semantic expansions, because they happen on the way to the fixation of truth conditional content, look like they can actually affect truth conditional content. And so you can see that in 13a through d, but you can especially see that sharply in this nice example due to a different person named Jonathan Cohen in 14a through c. Annie got married and had a baby. Annie had a baby and got married. They can have different truth values. And so that's like striking by itself, but it's even more striking when you look at C. If Annie got married and had a baby, her parents would be happy, but if she had a baby and got married, they'd be very unhappy. My intuition, I hope you'll share, is that that's possibly true. If so, that should be a problem for Grice, because Grice wanted to handle the conditional just in the classical way, and you're not supposed to get effects of the expansion, namely in that order, happening until after you've already run the conditionals, and so it shouldn't be possible to have a difference in truth value between the first conjunct and the second conjunct. So what these theorists claim is there's an effect of extra semantic expansion already in the semantics, and they call this intrusion or pragmatic intrusion. Right? Well, pragmatic intrusion looks like it happens with our examples of iliciture too, and so that's a reason for thinking, hey, maybe we're just doing more kind of Bach, Sperber, Wilson examples. So in 15a and b, if the company fires an employee who comes in late, a union complaint will be lodged. Every time the company fires an employee who comes in late, a union complaint is lodged. We think both are possibly true if there's a guy, Norman Snodgrass, who was discovered to be embezzling money, and he was fired on a day in which he happened to come in late and the union does nothing. The point being that he wasn't fired because he was late. He was fired because of the embezzlement, right? And that causes that event of his being fired just not to be relevant to the conditional or the quantifier in 15a and b. So that's an example of intrusion for us too. So are we just doing the same thing that those guys are doing? Well, we think no, because again, these guys are all thinking that their kinds of expansion are triggered by a crash and burn. Right? They have different ways of putting that. I have some footnotes that give you quotations to show that they're committed to that idea. But it looks like they really are committed to the idea that there has to be a failure to generate the expansion. And as I've argued already with our cases, they can be generated even when there's not a failure of any kind. Okay, so let me quickly just talk about this final kind of enrichments, local pragmatic strengthening. So people have been impressed with the idea that 16a, I'll give you $5 if you mow the lawn, is often read as I'll give you $5 if and only if you mow the lawn. Likewise, the resultative reading of 16b. So people have tons of fights about how to understand this class, how broad is it Gracian, is it not Gracian, whatever. But those cases can't subsume our cases, we claim. Why? First of all these cases are associated with particular lexical items. So the idea is that in 16a, It's the if. That word if has a conventional enrichment to if and only if. Okay? In 16b, it's the and that has a resultative reading. So they're really paired up with specific lexical items. Okay? But for elicitors, elicitors don't have to be generated by any particular lexical item. In fact, there are cases like the non-lexical case I gave you, the alarm clock, or for that matter, the jogger example, where it's actually hard to find any particular place smaller than the whole utterance that you think is the trigger. Okay. Second, not only is the trigger constrained, but the output is constrained in these local cases. So yeah, maybe there's an enrichment of if, but it's not enrich it to whatever the hell you like. It's enrich if to if and only if. So very specific, further conventionalized association, right? Likewise for the other local pragmatic strengthenings. But we think in eliciture, the search space is just not constrained like that. It's not like there's one particular content that you can get out. No, it could be really anything. So that's another reason not to take our case as being like this. And then the third thing is local enrichment is all about replacing the literal content with some enriched content. And as I've already said, eliciture is not about that. Eliciture is about leaving the original content in situ and supplementing it with more. Okay, so what I've just done is I've just run through, probably too quickly, a whole bunch of ways of thinking about extra-semantic enrichment that are already in the literature, and I've argued those don't subsume our cases. So we're onto something that needs its own analysis. And now I owe you a story, and I'm running out of time, so I won't. No, I'll tell you something. Okay, so here, we have a pretty deflationary story, actually. Our story is, this is basically just cognition happening. It's not some specifically linguistic thing going on. So to try to make that case, I want to compare our cases to non-linguistic cases. So look at 17a and b. These are not utterances. These are just descriptions of some scenarios. So in 17a, an observer sees a chronically tardy employee show up late for work again, and soon thereafter witnesses the employee being fired. 17b, observer sees a chronically tardy employee show up late for work again, and soon thereafter sees a customer asking the employee where the automotive department is. We say that a cognizer who witnesses the events described in 17a will likely infer that there's a causal relationship between the lateness and the firing. In 17b, she's likely not to make an inference that there's a connection between the lateness and the being asked where the automotive department is. Why? Well, something about how you can make the stories coherent together and fit together into some kind of associative story about how the world works, given your background knowledge and all the stuff you believe about the world. So our thought is, well, maybe just those very same non-linguistic strategies for making sense of the world, they show up also when we're trying to make sense of linguistically presented descriptions of the world. So in 18a and b, those are just supposed to be the linguisticized versions of the scenarios that were described above in 17a and b. And we suggest that just as there's an inference that's naturally made for 17a, there will naturally be an elicitor generated for 18a, and likewise, there's not one for 17b or 18b. So if that's the basic picture of what's going on, how do interpreters do what we're claiming that they do? Well, we want to suggest thinking about the inferences in terms of coherence establishment. So there's already a nice, rich body of research on discourse interpretation that says, hey, when you get two sentences presented right next to each other, as in something like 20, you try to make them coherent with one another. The boss fired the employee, he was always late. You try to tell a story about how they cohere. That's an intersentential phenomenon. Notice 19 in the footnote is odd. The employee broke his leg. He likes plums. in a normal context. You can do it, right? But it's actually a bit odd in a normal context. Why is it odd? Well, plausibly because it's kind of hard to find a way of making those two utterances coherent. And again, you can actually do it. The fact that you go on and try to find a way of making those things cohere with one another sort of makes the point that we're always looking to make discourses coherent. So here's our proposal. Yeah, there's that strategy for making discourses coherent. Well, maybe it works at the intrasentential level too. So you have clauses that can also be brought into relationships. So just like with 18A and B, those are clauses. Right. So 20 is the discourse, the intrasentential, the intersentential version. 18A is just the clausal or intersentential version of the very same processes. Okay, there are differences, but we think, which you can ask about if you want to. But we think it's the same basic process. Now, if that's right, one thing you would predict is that context can actually push around pretty easily what we think counts as coherent. And it can do so in ways that are really subtle, really depend on what seem like quite arbitrary features of the context. And exactly because of that flexibility, it actually makes it hard to imagine that there's going to be a finitely axiomatizable predictive theory of how this stuff works. So just to show you some strangeness, the kind of strange features that this can depend on, if you look at 21A, John fired the employee who looks like Justin Bieber. It's hard to get a causal elicitor there, but what if I tell you a story that, John is a protective parent and he has a Bieber fan daughter who also works for his company? Then you get a causal elicitor. But, can you imagine a theory of inference that actually took that variable into account beforehand? It's kind of hard to imagine. Now, of course, I've told you the story. Now you can go back and build the theory and you can put that variable in. But that wasn't my question. My question was, can you build a predictive theory in advance that knows about all the variables it's going to need to take advantage of? Similarly, 21B, a runner was hit by a car in Palo Alto last night, and ordinarily does invite the elicitor. But what if I say, the victim was a professional runner? Then I think the elicitor is weaker. Right? Or if we're both runners and we're at a meeting of our running club, and I say 21B, the elicitor is considerably weaker, it seems to me. Notice, actually, I had to switch from 1A. 1A was the jogger. 21B is a runner. Why did I do the switch? Well, because there aren't professional joggers, right? There are professional runners. And I think that the susceptibility of professionalization actually makes a difference to the goodness of the elicitor. That's the kind of sensitivity that I'm talking about that I find it hard to build a predictive theory of. So my basic worry, I've switched from we to me, because I guess Andy is less pessimistic than I am here. My worry here is that this is, when viewed in this light, the problem of giving a theory of elicitor is as easy or hard as the problem of giving a theory of cognition. It's kind of like solving the frame problem. That's my worry. Okay, so to conclude then, look, everybody knows that you want languages to take advantage of Edgersi's knowledge store and inference and all that stuff. And Grice has made that into a cottage industry. People knew that before Grice, of course. But since Grice, there's been all kinds of research that's been really fruitful and wonderful, trying to say just how those inferences work. Grice really had his eye in particular on rationality and cooperativity, these like super high-level facts about our talk exchanges. But even Grice thinks, notice, and this came up on the discussion board, that the properties in question, they're not specifically linguistic, right? He thinks rationality and cooperativity happen outside language too, right? So we agree with him about that part. The research since Grice has gone in a much more specifically linguistic direction, right? And I think we want to get back to the Gricean roots, at least on that dimension. But elicitors, we think, differ from Gricean and non-Gricean types of expansion that are already in the literature. They don't have the same kind of dependence on crash and burn failure. We don't think they have. So the other ones, very often you can come up with a easily specifiable, perhaps axiomatizable theory of the contents that are generated. We think that's unlikely to be possible for licitures in general. All you can say is, well, the speaker chose a linguistic form of a certain sort, brings to mind an inference, so she must have intended to allow me to make that inference. And if that's the weakness of the invitation, then of course it's no surprise that felicity is undamaged when we don't make the inference, which is what we observed. Of course, the cost of thinking about things this way is that the association of ideas, the mental processes that are underlying the inferences, they're way less constrained, which means that the search problem is a lot harder. And exactly because the search problem is harder, you're not going to, well, we worry that you're not going to have the same kind of procedural resolution mechanisms that everybody's been talking about for all these years. So I guess there are different ways to think about the contribution that a literature is poised to make. One way of thinking about things, the modest view is, hey, look, here's this new type that sits along the other types of extra semantic enrichment. People should pay attention to these cases. We also have this immodest view on some days, which is that really our case is the general case. The cases that other people have been studying, those are special cases. Those are licitures where, for one reason or another, which deserves an interesting story why, for one reason or another, the search space gets constrained down to something more tractable. There's been tons and tons of research on scalar implicatures. Like that's the good case. We think we know lots about scalar implicatures. Okay, fine, but we want to suggest, yeah, well, that's because there's something that constrains our search there. We don't have a lot of confidence in the possibility of scaling up from those constrained searches to the general problem of search. And so maybe we've obscured with all that research the larger portion of the iceberg. Thanks.